We all want more time. Okay, are we good? Okay, I want to introduce you to the person that's really, not really, absolutely has made this all possible. That's Walter Cruttenden. Cruttenden, did I say that right? Real good. Yeah. Walter Cruttenden. And just introduce you because many of you know he simply made this possible, but I don't know if you know anything else about him, so I want to say a few things. He said to keep it short, but I'll do my best. Walter is the director of the Binary Research Institute, which is really fascinating to me. As I understand it, they are studying, I'm looking at Walter. If I'm making mistakes, tell me. But Walter is the director of the Binary Research Institute, which is looking at the celestial mechanics related to this concept of precession that we've been hearing about all. And something that's absolutely fascinating to me is the concept that our sun, our solar system, may be part of a binary system. And I think that's an incredible possibility. There's a lot of ancient mythology that would tie in with that. As I understand it, that many suns now, many stars that we're aware of are in fact parts of binary systems. It may explain some of the anomalies, may explain some of the things that we've been talking about, including in my last talk. So that's very exciting. Walter himself, I see as, he's involved in many things. Historian, he's a historian looking at the history of ancient times, the theory behind it, what could be happening with these different cycles that we've been talking about all along. He has produced and written an incredible documentary called The Great Year. I'm sure as many of you have seen it, and it copies available for it. For many of us, it really introduces this whole concept of the precession of the ages, the cycles of time that have become so important, I think are so important for us to be aware of. He's also written an excellent book called Lost Star of Myth and Time, and I recommend it highly to everyone. So please pick up a copy of that. It's just incredible work that's being done here. And I could go on, but I want to just mention, last but not least, he is the founder of this CPAK series, Conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge. It's now in its fifth, is that correct? This is the fifth annual CPAK. I've had the pleasure of being at, I think all of them except the very first one. I believe the first one was actually not open to the public. Is that correct, Walter? Yeah. But it's been going on, and I think it's important not just for bringing much of this knowledge to the public, audiences, for people to come and interact, but also for people like myself who have been presenting. It really has affected me, and I think in a very positive way, to get me interacting with other people, to be thinking about these types of issues. I know that every time I leave CPAK, I go on, I get all these questions in my mind, and it causes me to start looking into things seriously and researching things that, 3 years ago I didn't think I'd be looking at. So it's had very much a personal effect on me, and I want to thank Walter for that very much and how he's made this really all possible for all of us. So I present to you Walter, and I believe he'll be talking about Hamlets Mill today, which is absolutely central to the themes that all of us are studying here at the Conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. This working? So good morning again. This is a book that really turned me on when I first read it. And so it's a privilege and an honor to be with you and talking about what I think is one of the most interesting books, if not one of the most revealing books in academia today, and that is Hamlet's Mill. And as a matter of fact, I dedicated my own book to two other people. One was Sri Yukteswar, and one was the authors of this book, Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Dechend. So I know that some of the other speakers mentioned it briefly, and we will, I'll kind of try to cover mostly new information in this. Interesting that Myth and folklore has been around for thousands of years, to the very beginning of history. And yet we're just getting around to exploring it. We're just getting around to looking at it in a scientific way, just considering it as gibberish of ancient people. And so today I'd like to cover 4 points, but let me start with a little intro on the authors. Giorgio de Santillana was the former professor of the history of science at MIT. He was the chair of that department. He had his degree in physics, studied astronomy, mathematics, was really a very good scholar, and also known as a bit of a mystic. And the younger Hertha von Dechend, older in this picture obviously, but she had studied under the great Frobenius, and she was a cultural ethnologist and held a similar post to Giorgio over at Goethe University on the Frankfurt University campus. And she had the suspicion that history wasn't quite as we were being taught in the textbooks. And the reason for this is she had studied many different cultures around the world, including the Dogon that Laird talked about yesterday, cultures, and she found that their histories were so much different than our own. And so she became suspicious, and Giorgio had shared these same concerns. In fact, he had written a book in the early 60s called Origins of Science, where he traced the origins of science not just to the Renaissance or not just to the Greeks, but way back to prehistory, to the very fringes of any recorded history. So you might call these two the Robert Schoch and the John Anthony West of their era. They were the first 2 alternative historians. And so today we'll cover 4 points. The first is that myth and folklore is not just gibberish, it is a scientific language. And Giorgio believed that there were great minds in prehistory on par with a Newton or a Kepler or an Einstein, but that they spoke a completely different language. They spoke something that we can hardly even relate to, not to mention understand. The second point I want to cover is that precession is a recurring theme. Now, they don't always call it precession, but they talk about a movement of the stars, and they often refer to it as a mill or a quern or a sampo or a dial or something that turns. And as it turns, it affects time. It actually creates time. The ancients believed that it ushered in new eras, new epochs in history that were completely different than the prior epoch. And personally, I believe that when we really understand this mill and how it works, we help place back in history. We find out where we are in time. And that's something that's very precious that I think has been lost by this linear view that anything that came before us must be more primitive. With that view, there's really nothing to learn in ancient history. And yet, as we're hearing throughout this conference, there's a lot we can learn from the ancients. And it all makes sense in context of this mill. And the final point I want to cover is that there's a little bit of Hamlet in each of us. And Hamlet is just the name character that Shakespeare, of course, used for his hero in his story. But it's a character that we find throughout history, and we'll talk about that in some detail. So let's get going here. The setup here, I want to read a little bit from both Hertha's voice and Giorgio's voice so you can kind of hear where they're coming from. But the setup on this one is that Hertha had been working on understanding myth and folklore for many years, and she hadn't been making much progress. And she'd thought about astronomy,